The thin tongue of coast was so flat that it was like a scar on the sea. Nothing rose above the level of the one-storied shacks scattered about it, except a lighthouse, standing up like a vast white candle in a wide, lofty sky, so that from a distance it seemed to float in air. By the end of September, after the heat of summer, the sea flowers were dead. A long, flat tide floated in, almost limped in, washing over and over again the same wide, salt-grey waste of sand. Salt dust blew on small winds from one side of the road to the other, rattling harshly on steely patches of sea thistle and dune grass, and then blew back again. From the end of the peninsula, it was a 2-mile walk for Brand to get the papers. Every morning he walked along the cracked concrete road and bought the papers and sometimes a magazine from the shop where squat black placeboats, curtained about with kipper-coloured netting, were beached from the bay. He was always thirsty by the time he began to walk back along the shore. Halfway back was a shack facing the sea that had tin-plate advertisements nailed over one side of it so that it glittered harshly in the sun. He noticed it first not because of the advertisements, but because it had outside it a square of grass. The grass, watered all summer, was vivid green in the desert of beach and sand. In the middle of it was a white flagpole, and at the top of the flagpole was a triangular scarlet flag with ICES sewn across it in white letters. He'd been there nearly a week when he first went in. Sun and sea air had warped the jerry-built glass door so that he had to push it violently before it would open. Behind the counter stood a woman in a black fur coat and a green scarf on her head, and through a window behind her he could see the sea. "And about time, too," she said. "I thought you were never coming." She was smoking a cigarette, and she did not take the cigarette from her mouth when she spoke to him. Suddenly, looking at him again, she burst out laughing. "Oh, God alive, I thought it was the taxi." He smiled, and she began coughing violently from smoke and laughter, so that grey ash spilt in a fine cloud on the black fur coat. "Hear that?" she called. "Gentleman came in. I thought it was the cab." Behind the counter was a door, and he could see a kitchen beyond it, but no one answered. "Terribly sorry, sir." The cigarette smoke burned straight up into her baggy, colourless eyes. "Very rude of me. Something we can get you?" "A glass of milk?" he said. "Well, sorry, no milk. It's the drought. They cut us down." She took the cigarette out of her mouth, coughing ash on the counter. "Excuse me. Cup of tea?" "Cup of tea." "Haven't seen a taxi anywhere, I suppose, have you? What do you make the time?" Just after 11. "We're supposed to be here for 11. Puts years on you." She looked beyond him, irritated, through the glass door. "Same with everything." He did not answer. She took a packet of cigarettes from the pocket of her fur coat and lit a fresh cigarette from the old. "Gentleman would like a cup of tea," she called. "Got one on?" There was no answer. "Why don't you sit down?" she said. "On holiday? Got a beach hut here?" "Up by the lighthouse." "Getting a bit late in the season. What do you do with yourself all day?" He did not know what to say. There was no point in telling her he was bored all day. Then suddenly she began coughing again, this time with excitement, and in the same moment he heard the taxi on the road outside. "God alive, I must fly." She came from behind the counter, waddling and coughing. "Cab's here," she called. "No message for Fred?" She pulled the door open and went out across the square of grass under the flagpole to where, on the concrete beyond, the taxi was turning round. The thin door banged loudly, shaking the walls of the shack, but there was no answer from the room behind. He sat on one of the stools by the counter and opened the paper. Every day they were saying it was the driest, hottest summer for 50 years. There was already something boring about the sequence of dead, dry days and the calm glitter of the sea. Sugar? He looked up to see a girl standing at the door behind the counter. The high sea light coming in at the window fell full on her face and made her eyes especially seem very large. They were dark brown eyes with extraordinary whites that were not really white at all. They were a pure pale blue, wet and shining, that made the point of the pupils almost black. "Please," he said. "One or two?" "One." He heard the lump of sugar clink on the spoon. She came up to the counter, carrying a cup in one hand and a teapot in the other. "Anything in the paper?" She poured out the tea. "Not much." Never is." She tried for a second or two to read the paper where it was on the counter, upside down. "Oh, anything to eat? I forgot to ask you." "No," he said. "Just the tea." She gave up trying to read the paper upside down, and for some moments stood with her arms folded on the counter. She had slim cream hands, the skin thin and transparent, so that the veins shone through like soft blue tendrils, and the fingers were slightly upturned as they lay on the smooth golden hairs of her forearms. "Busy these days?" he said. "I can be busy, just how it takes me." "Where are you?" "Up by the lighthouse." She turned the paper round where it lay on the counter, turning it with one long finger so that she could read it with her head only slightly averted. Her neck was long and deep cream under the dark brown hair. "Ever been up there?" she said. "Oh, no, not me. Makes me giddy." "Does it?" she said. "Funny. Never affects me. Got a beach hut?" "Yes." "What do you do for cooking? I hear there's no gas up there." "I never bother." "You're the sort of people who put us out of business," she said. He did not know what to say. He stirred his tea without drinking and remembered the woman running for the taxi. "That your mother?" "Don't blame me," she said. "She was born first. Off to London for the week, while I look after the sea." With that curious expression, she turned the paper round again, so that she could read it right way up. He found himself screwing his own head round, trying to read it as she had done, upside down. And as he did so, he was aware of her body pressed against the counter. She gave him a quick glance, and then went on reading. Then, after some moments, she spoke without looking up. "Not drinking your tea?" He sipped it gently, looking down at her over the edge of the cup. She turned the paper over. "I'll bet you think I'm rude, reading your paper." "No," he said. "You can have it. I don't want it. Keep it, and I'll call in later." "Well, come in, and I'll get you a meal," she said. "Why don't you? You must eat sometimes." "I could." "Well, say it as if you wanted to. Nothing elaborate, just eggs or something, but say it as if you wanted to." She stared up at him with great brown eyes that were casual and bored, but brilliant, too, with bright sea light. He looked back at her and felt the blood beating up in his throat. He thought, too, that she knew it was beating there, because she held him a little longer with that same slow, bored stare. "All right?" "All right," he said. She smiled. She had a way of smiling by opening her mouth and putting her tongue slowly outward and pressing it against her teeth, and then upward, casually and softly, against her lip. "About 6, she said. "About 6. She pressed her tongue upward against her lips, and then, as if deliberately letting him go, lowered her eyes and folded her long, creamy arms on the paper. "Now drink your tea," she said. Walking back along the sea road, he thought of Ella. Things had not been going well with Ella. More and more she seemed to him like a peremptory, bright-nosed hen decked up. She'd begun to be a great one on committees. At supper, after the office, she bored him with histories of committees, rather as she must, he thought, have bored the committees. Sometimes, in hasty moments, he did silly things, like putting his socks on inside out, and that in turn would urge her to endless, nagging resolutions, all of which he felt she'd put down on the agenda of their married differences. Whenever she came home from committees, she wore the same dark brown straw hat. It was too small for her. It sat on her head, mocking her like a ridiculous piece of flat, stale toast. He longed to jump on it. One day he almost did jump on it, and she screamed, "The trouble with you is you can't tolerate anything but yourself. You're so selfish, so vain." And in a fit of rage, he'd driven the car down to the sea. Back at the point by the lighthouse, he read the papers and watched the tide. The sandy peninsula projected so far out to sea that ships skirted it by only 150 yards. Sometimes liners came so close that he could see even the sparkle of drinks in passengers' glasses in the dining saloons or the lounge. And sometimes passengers waved their hands. Among them were surely men who hated their wives because they wore hats like slices of toast. and wives who hated their husbands for the monstrosity of trivial things. He began to think of the girl in the cafe. Her voice, throaty and casual, seemed to come along the seashore with the lazy softness of the tide. He thought of her hands, and then the extraordinary dark brown eyes, and then the bored, casual way of pressing her tongue against her teeth, and the bored, casual way of trying to read the paper upside down. He swam twice during the afternoon. The sea made him hungry and drowsy. The sun curved round and shone flat on his face. He slept without realizing it, and woke suddenly with the idea that one of the ships was ramming the point. It was a liner painted white for the tropics, and it seemed for a second or two to tangle itself with the white cone of the lighthouse and come bearing down on him where he lay. It was past 6 when he woke, and nearly 7 o'clock by the time he'd dressed and walked along the sea road to where the scarlet flag was waving above the square of watered grass in the evening sun. The shack was closed. He started to rap on the thin glass door. The door was loose and rattled loudly, echoing across the empty beach in the warm, still air. After a moment or two, he gave it up and went round to the back. The girl was lying on the sand in a white and red-spotted cotton beach dress, without shoes or stockings, her long, creamy legs and arms stretched out in the sun. She did not get up. "You're a nice one," she said. "I went to sleep. I didn't realize. I got fed up and closed. Nobody to talk to all afternoon, so I came out to look after the sea." Again he noticed that curious expression. "I'm sorry," he said. She rolled over and lay sideways, looking up at him. "Well, what do you fancy?" "Anything, if it's not too late. Whatever you've got." "It isn't what I've got. It's what you fancy." "Whatever you've got, I'll fancy," he said. "Well, if that's the way you look at it." She moved once again on the sand, turning her body. "Can't see you. You're upside down." He remembered how she'd read the newspaper upside down, and something in the turn of her body immediately electrified him. "Oh, you're the same man. I wondered. Your voice sounded different." "Disappointed?" "Oh, no, no. I just got the impression of you in my mind somehow, and I like to get the right impression." She suddenly knelt up, brushing away sand from her dress. "Well, let's go in. The sea can look after itself for a bit." It struck him again as curious how she spoke now and then of looking after the sea. She stood up, brushing sand from first one leg, and then another, and then from her arms. "Am I all sand at the back?" "On your shoulders." "Brush me down, will you? It gets into everything, food and everything, beds and everywhere." He brushed with both hands at the half-circle of her naked shoulder. The skin was smooth and oily, and he felt the blood beat up into his throat as he touched it with the sweeping tips of his fingers under the thick brown hair. "I'll fry you a Dover sole," she said. "A good fat one. How's that?" "It's just what I fancy." She had the sole ready in about half an hour. She laid him a table overlooking the sea. From there, as he waited, he could see the lighthouse. The lamps had not begun to burn, and the tall white cylinder looked more than ever like an unlit candle on the narrow scar of sand. "Been up the lighthouse yet?" She was in the kitchen, and he called back, "No, I told you. Makes me feel giddy." "You'll have to try it some day." "Not me," he said. The sole, dipped in golden breadcrumbs, was nicely fried. "All right," she said. "Lovely. What about you?" "Oh, you're a customer. Can't eat with the customers." "I hoped you could." "Well, there's no law against it. I'll have a cup of tea." She had changed her dress, and now she was wearing a thin frock of silky, sea-bright green. It gave a smouldering, candle-like warmth to her bare arms as she crooked them on the table and watched him eat. "You wanted that. You were hungry," she said. "Oh, I didn't bother about lunch." She looked at the sea. It was after 8 o'clock, and now, suddenly, in a wonderful flash, the lamps in the lighthouse began turning, swinging startling bars of light on darkening water and shore. "There she goes," the girl said. "I always love that. It sends a thrill right through me, right down, a real thrill. I watch it every night." She was watching the light eagerly, her mouth parted, her tongue touching her lip as she smiled. As it grew slowly darker, ships with star-like navigation lights appeared across a copper-crested sea. After watching them for some time, she turned her face and looked at him. "Married?" she said. "No," he said. "Well, you ought to get yourself a nice wife that can cook." "Are you married?" he said. "No," she said, "not me." Who was Ella? The sudden accusing unreality of Ella forced itself on his conscience for a moment, and then assumed the remoteness of one of the lights creeping slowly away to sea. His wife seemed in every way like one of those dim lights going out, going away forever. Committees, and a hat like toast, a gender of married faults, and the face like a peremptory pecking hen's. There was no lie about them. They did not exist anymore. "What about Fred?" he said. He remembered the parting words of her mother. "Oh, Fred. Fred's nobody. He's cook up there. We got another cafe at King's Cross. He's cook up there." The lids of her eyes closed down smoothly as she looked at his empty cup and plate. "More tea?" "No, thank you." "Like to go outside for a breath of air?" "If you like." They were already outside when she spoke once again of looking after the sea. The shack had a small railed veranda overlooking the beach. She leaned against one of the posts of it, and as she stared at the sea and spoke again of looking after it, he said, "Think it'll run away or something?" "No." "Well, what then?" "Oh, nothing." He watched the lighthouse flashing on her face, heightening sharply every few seconds or so the candle-like warmth given by the green dress. And then he said, "Odd. What's the idea of looking after the sea? That's one thing that'll look after itself." She turned on him in the moment that the lighthouse flashed. It gave the impression of her entire body leaping into flame. All her bored, casual face flared up, bright and bitter and angry. "What else have I got to do? God, I got nothing else to do but look after it, have I? Nobody to talk to from Monday to Friday, nothing to do, nobody to talk to. What else have I got to do but look after it? God, I feel it's all I got left." The act of kissing her for the first time had in it the shock of something bare and bruising and antagonistic. He'd not expected it to be like that. He'd wanted it to be drawn out of her sleepy, languid casualness. Now she held him with both arms and the stiffened frame of her body, driving her mouth at his with the dry hunger of long boredom. And all the time the lighthouse flashed with its dazzling revolutions on her face. After a time she was quieter, and they lay down on the sand. He could hear the sea, gentle, the tide out, endless small waves licking backwards in the warm September darkness. "If you hadn't turned up, I'd have gone off my head. I thought you wouldn't turn up. I'd have gone off my head." He liked her more as she quietened. She seemed to grow drowsy and languid again, the frame of her body in its relaxation melting into the deep softness he wanted. The entire antithesis of Ella, the antidote to all his own dry boredom and rage. He found her limbs in long, deep curves. Her skin had seemed so delicate with its fine transparence that the full discovered strength of her body surprised him. "I wanted you like that," she said, "by the sea. I wanted you terribly." The lighthouse flashed on her face. "Be careful how you touch me. You make me feel how the lighthouse does." Walking home at last, after midnight, he understood her feeling about the lighthouse. It had been the flame in the drabness of her boredom, burning and flashing suddenly to excite her once a day. He was pleased to think that he was like that. He was pleased to stand where he was and watch, like a fading down-channel light, the dying, discordant figure of Ella and Ella's hat, the former world of committees and catechisms, and the pecking hen. He felt slightly intoxicated and elated, as if he stood on the top of the lighthouse, watching the minute and inconsequential light of something that had bored and angered him, and would do so no longer. He'd arranged to go back for lunch next day. "Not too early," she said, "because I can close up from 2 to 5. You can swim and have a lie in the sun." And in the morning, for the first time, he did not trouble to fetch the papers. It was enough to wait for the afternoon. But about 2 o'clock, after they'd eaten, and just as she was about to lock up, something happened. He looked out of the window and saw a wild troop of Boy Scouts invading the shore. Soon they began to invade the shack. He had dreamed so long of lying with her in warm sun, alone on the shore, that the sight of scores of small boys besieging her for ice cream and drinks and sandwiches brought him furious frustration. She, too, looked desperate, and he could have hit a ridiculous grey-haired scoutmaster who said, "You may remember us. We dropped in last year. We remembered your flag." Bathing and yelling, punting footballs, littering the shore with cartons and trousers and shirts and papers, the boys stayed until 6 o'clock. So many of them came into the shack that finally he took off his jacket, and for 4 hours, impotent and full of hatred for them, he helped the girl behind the counter. All afternoon there was a dry hunger in her eyes that made him think she could not wait for him. "Well, it'll please Ma," she said when it was all over. And then a cheerful thought, "Anyway, we took enough so we can close tomorrow and the next day. That's if there's no Boy Scouts." "There'll be no Boy Scouts," he said. "Tomorrow we'll go to the lighthouse." "Oh, that's an idea." "Perhaps we could have a trip in the car." "I'd like that. That would be lovely." Again and again, in the darkness on the shore, the lighthouse flashed on her face. Her long arms held him down on the soft sand, and the deep brown eyes burned insatiably. Next day, when they climbed the lighthouse, a little breeze was blowing in fitful gusts against the sun. It seemed to him that the top of the lighthouse swayed. All his fear of heights rushed up through his body, and he felt the irresistible, paralyzing terror of wanting to go over. It froze the back of his legs coldly, and he was hardly conscious of the keeper, who was also a guide, saying, "The point puts on another 6 feet of land every year. Can you see where it's creeping out? 10 or 15 years, and they'll have to be thinking of building another lighthouse." Brand could not look, and the keeper pointed inland. "That's the old lighthouse. That shows you where the point used to be." All the time the girl moved carelessly from side to side of the lighthouse top, following the keeper's fingers, leaning nonchalantly over, long arms folded, staring straight down. To Brand's intense horror, she hung over the side, laughing, waving to groups of people below. "For God's sake," he said, and felt sick at the thought that a beating squall of wind might move the wrong way and take her over. "Now, if you'll follow me down, sir," the keeper said. They stood for a moment together, alone on the top. She held him flat against her body, her skirt flapping in the breeze against her legs, and he could have sworn that once again the lighthouse swayed. She kissed him, holding him rigidly, but he knew the lighthouse rocked. For some idiotic reason he thought of the precarious, toast-like hat perched on Ella's head. And the girl said, "Don't be so jittery. There's nothing to be scared of." "I hate it. I always have hated it." "It's because you let it," she said. "If you looked down, just made yourself look down, you'd be all right. Come on. Look down. Make yourself. It's better." Once again she leaned far over. This time she held his hand, and for the space of a second or two he looked down too, his entire body wrapped in a stiffened chrysalis of vertigo. A sinister, narrowing world of shore, of boats, of faces, and of kaleidoscope sea waves seemed to draw him down. And then the girl laughed at him again, mocking slightly. "Come on. You can't take it. The keeper's waiting." Even 50 or 60 feet below, he could still feel the horror in his legs. And he said, "Don't you feel anything? Doesn't it affect you at all?" "Only like you," she said. "That nice feeling right through my body." She was pleased about the car. From the new lighthouse they drove inland, through a flat, sea-beaten world of drab shingle and faded sea poppy, towards the old. He thought its black-tarred stump looked hideous even among the cracked concrete of ruined sea defences and shabby summer bungalows, whose doorsteps were being slowly buried by autumn sand. "Like an old lady going to a funeral or something," the girl said. Like every horrifying experience, the cold moments at the lighthouse top afterwards exhilarated him. For each of the 3 following nights, as he lay on the shore with the girl, he felt a certain vague bravery about it all. "I'm your lighthouse," he would say to her. Already it was Friday, and for 2 nights he'd not troubled to go back to sleep at the hut. "I make you feel the same way." Not after tonight, she said. A moment of freezing sickness, identical with all he'd felt on the lighthouse, turned his stomach over. What are you talking about? Ma comes tomorrow. Did you forget? She's down every weekend, Saturday to Monday. Oh, God, he said. Is that all? I thought you'd better keep out of the way, she said. Just for a night or two. I could come in for a cup of tea or something, he said. Couldn't I? She'd never know. Oh, not Ma, the old gimlet. Not Ma. You never get over Ma. God, he said. The whole weekend. There's all next week. Plenty of time. He felt her reasoning sweetness express itself in one of those slow, casual, expanding smiles. Her tongue touched her lip, and a wonderful beauty of dark eyes held him profoundly as the lighthouse flashed. She said, a rest from each other will do us good. Then we'll have all next week. What are you worrying for? I want you all the time. Terribly. I'm here, she said, and she pressed herself down into the dark, dry sand. Nobody's stopping you. The next day, Saturday, he did not see her at all. He could not bring himself to walk along the sea road. He didn't want the papers. Teasing him, she'd said, you can always go up the lighthouse. You can wave from there. I'll see you and I'll know it's you. And that afternoon, in a moment of puerile anguish, he went up. A great dry loneliness had held him all day. From the top of the lighthouse, the tranquil bay was like pure glass, windless and beautiful. He stared across lines of placeboats and a few trippers to the shack. The red flag had not enough air to raise it from the pole, but he could see underneath it the spray of a water hose sprinkling the bright square of grass. Presently he saw figures there. It seemed like a man, and perhaps he tried to persuade himself the girl, but it was much too far away. He even waved his hand, but nothing happened, and soon, driven by sudden misery and vertigo, he hurried down. For the rest of that day, and during Sunday, his only remedy was to swim and walk westward away from the shack, in the queer, derelict, half-urban, half-marsh country between the two lighthouses. He began to think of Ella. Did she wonder about him? Had she gone round in panic circles of distress? Had it spoiled the routine of committees, the hideous, respectable pose of the toast-like hat? What would she say, he thought, if she could see me now? Poor dear old Ella. The ease of that long, generous body on the sand would have shocked her, would have made her realize that there were not only women who gave more pleasure than they asked, but gave it without asking questions, as beautifully as flowers. But that day, as he tried to wear out Sunday, he did not have many amused and rather fanciful thoughts of women like flowers. Ella appeared to stand up in the flat, endless day, with the gauntness of the old lighthouse above the ugly marsh. She was a terrible relic, Ella, and somehow Sunday was her day. She had a great fondness for fussing about the kitchen on Sunday mornings, roasting beef, baking a particular kind of tart called Maids of Honor. What maid, he would tease her, and what honor. Her hands were floury, and he ate the tarts from the stove while they were still hot. Today, inexplicably, he felt keenly the absence of these trivialities. It was not permanent, he knew that. It was just Sunday. Monday would show it all to have been another example of puerile heartache. But today he could not bear it at all. And finally, because he could not bear it, he walked along about 7:30 to the shack. Lights were burning, and a few people were having supper. He walked past and got himself several drinks a mile farther on at a place called the Fisherman's Arms. When he walked back, lights were still burning in the shack. The place seemed empty. After a few moments, he went in. The girl's mother was leaning on the counter, coughing cigarette ash down the heavy black front of her body. But there was no sign of the girl. "Yes, sir," she said. "Too late for anything. What'll it be? Coffee, tea, orange?" "I'll take coffee." While he drank it, he said, "Remember me? I'm the fellow you mistook for the taxi driver last Monday." "Good alive, so it is." Coughing and laughing, she sprayed a small cloud of cigarette ash. "I don't know whatever you thought of me, sir." "But your daughter made up for it. Got me a nice meal that day." Nice cook," she said. He looked round the cafe. "Not here tonight?" "Gone to the flicks with Fred." "Fred?" he said. He could feel a horrible tightness, cold and not unlike the vertigo he so hated and dreaded, taking hold of his body, cramping it with jealousy and fear. "Boyfriend?" "Boyfriend, my foot," she said. "Husband?" Monday brought, as he knew it would, the notion that to be lonely for Ella was something quite puerile. Between the thought of Ella and the thought of the girl, he felt a growing sense of being cheated. Ella, he felt, had got him into this. He felt dislocated, slightly crazy, trapped. It was late afternoon before he could bring himself to go along to the cafe. The girl had closed the cafe, and he found her lying behind it, as he always did, on the sand. The breeze of the last few days had piled up still higher the smooth, clean breasts of sand below the veranda, submerging yet another of the steps. In one of the hollows between these breasts, she lay in her red beach dress, staring at the sky. "Oh, God, I thought you were never coming. I wanted you terribly. I hated the waiting." He let himself be drawn down, almost sucked down by her long arms and the tightened frame of her body, stiffly anguished, as it had been when he'd first kissed her. "Did you want me?" she said. "All the time." "How was the weekend?" "Oh, terrible. She talked and talked, nothing but talk. I was bored to death." "What did you do?" "Went to the lighthouse." "There," she said. "You see? How was it?" "I'm getting better. It's like you said. I just need practice." She laughed, pressing her tongue against her lips, her brown eyes brilliant and languid and burning in the shell-like whites. "One more trip and you'll be all right," she said. Might be. "Probably when you're all right, you won't make me feel how you do. Had you thought of that?" "No." "Make me feel like it now," she said. He did not speak of Fred until they lay in the sand in darkness. A twisted and crazy sort of dislocation made him keep back until then all he felt by way of the trap, the cheating and the jealousy. Out at sea, small navigation lights floated about like stars, and one of them, as before, was Ella, dying and fading away, and he hated her because of his pain. "How was the husband?" he said. "You don't have to speak like that," she said. "No need to speak like that." Her face, in the flash from the lighthouse, was undisturbed, casual as ever. "You didn't tell me," he said. "It didn't make any difference. It didn't, and it doesn't now." "Me during the week and a change for Sundays," he said. Rage beat at his pride with lacerating strokes of pain. He felt himself drop away, crazy and blinded by acid dregs of cheating and jealousy. All the time he was aware of her moving her body with quiet suppleness deeper into the sand, and that movement too made him ache with helpless bitterness. "You didn't tell me either," she said. "But it wouldn't make any difference if you did. No difference at all." "I'd nothing to tell." His voice was quiet. He could hear the tide slowly coming in across the sand. "Well then, who should care?" She moved in the sand again, supple and astonishingly quiet, and in distraction he found her body once again in long, deep curves. The flash of the lighthouse fell on her mouth, making it glisten, and then leaving it wonderfully dark again as the light swung out to sea. "We're just two people," she said. "People get so messed up about the right and wrong of things. We're just two people. What do we want with rights and wrongs? All we want is here." No, not here, he thought. Vainly he tried to listen to the tide, but he was distracted by the feel of her soft body into agonies of mind that flung up thoughts of Ella and the lighthouse. He determined not to be afraid of the lighthouse any longer. And now, too, he remembered the girl high up there, leaning over. "Come on, kiss me. It's nothing," she said. "Come on, just once more, like the lighthouse. In case it cures you. You never know." She folded him down into a body that had lost the last of its rigidity, and seemed now to have the quality of burying him into itself, like the sand. The lighthouse flashed several times across the shore, and across the long, oblivious kiss. and then she freed her face and said, smiling, "When do we go up again?" "Tomorrow," he said. "When do you suppose they'll put up the new lighthouse?" she said. He did not answer. His heart at that moment seemed to stop beating. His body lay imprisoned in its harsh chrysalis of jealousy and weakness and fear. He could not look at her face. And down on the shore there was no movement but a small wind eating at the sea, and innumerable small waves casually consuming what remained of the waste of sand.